the foundation of forever. The autumn leaves crunched beneath Nolan Rivers' feet as he approached the familiar brick building of Westfield University. 7 years had passed since graduation, yet the campus still felt like stepping back in time. He adjusted his navy blazer and checked his phone, 20 minutes early, as always. The reunion committee had done well with the decorations. Warm string lights draped across the entrance to the alumni hall, creating an inviting glow against the October evening. Inside, the chatter of familiar voices mixed with soft jazz music. Nolan grabbed a name tag from the registration table and scanned the crowd, searching for faces he might recognize. Most looked vaguely familiar but older, softened by time and experience. He was contemplating whether to grab a drink first when a laugh from across the room stopped him cold. That laugh. Melodic, genuine, with just a hint of snort at the end when something was truly funny. He'd know it anywhere. Violet? She turned from her conversation with Professor Martinez, and time seemed to pause. Violet Chen looked exactly the same, yet completely different. Her dark hair was shorter now, grazing her shoulders in soft waves, instead of the long ponytail she'd worn throughout college. She wore a burgundy dress that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes that were currently widening in surprise and delight. "Nolan Rivers, you haven't changed a bit," she said, walking toward him with that same confident stride he remembered from their countless library sessions. "Well, except for the beard," he replied, running a hand over his carefully groomed facial hair. "And you look older, more tired, ready for a career change?" she interrupted with a self-deprecating smile. "Beautiful," he finished simply, surprised by his own honesty. A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Flatterer, though I'll take it after the week I've had." They fell into conversation as naturally, as if no time had passed at all. Violet told him about the independent bookstore she'd opened 3 years ago in the historic district downtown, how she'd named it Chapter and Verse and filled it with cozy reading nooks and locally sourced coffee. Her eyes lit up when she described the children's story times she hosted every Saturday morning and the book clubs that had become the social heart of the neighborhood. Nolan shared his journey as a freelance graphic designer, how he'd finally built up enough clients to work from his home studio. The satisfaction of seeing his designs on everything from restaurant logos to album covers. He mentioned his recent breakup with casual indifference, though Violet's quick flash of concern didn't go unnoticed. "Remember how we used to study until 3 in the morning in the library basement?" Violet asked, settling into a corner table they'd claimed as their own for the evening. "You mean how you studied while I mostly complained about Professor Henderson's impossible assignments and ate your snacks? You always brought the coffee, though. Terrible coffee, but coffee nonetheless. Hey, that gas station coffee was a college staple. It built character." They laughed, and suddenly Nolan realized how much he'd missed this. Missed her. Not in a romantic way, he told himself, just the easy companionship they'd shared. Violet had always been the one person who could make him feel completely comfortable in his own skin. "You know what's funny?" Violet said, swirling the wine in her glass. "I always wondered what happened to you after graduation. We promised to stay in touch, but life got so busy and then it felt too late to reach out. I looked you up on social media a few times," Nolan admitted. "But you never post personal stuff, just bookstore updates. I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me." "Are you kidding? Nolan, you were my favorite study partner, my favorite procrastination enabler, my favorite—" She paused, something shifting in her expression. "My favorite friend from college." The word friend hung in the air between them, comfortable yet somehow incomplete. As the evening wound down and other alumni began filtering out, neither seemed eager to leave. They exchanged phone numbers, real numbers this time, not just social media connections, and made tentative plans for coffee the following week. Walking to their cars under the campus streetlights, Violet turned to him one more time. I'm really glad we found each other again, Nolan. Me too, Vi. Me too. As he drove home, Nolan couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just begun. The rhythm of routine 3 months had passed since the reunion, and Wednesday had become Nolan's favorite day of the week. Not because it marked the middle of the work week, but because it meant coffee with Violet at chapter and verse. What had started as a casual let's catch up sometime had evolved into a sacred ritual neither of them dared to skip. The October reunion felt like a lifetime ago now that January snow dusted the bookstore's front windows. Nolan pushed through the door, the familiar chime announcing his arrival, and breathed in the comforting scent of old books and fresh coffee. Violet looked up from behind the counter where she was arranging a display of new releases, her face brightening with the same genuine smile that had become the highlight of his week. "Right on time," she said, glancing at the vintage clock on the wall that read exactly 2:30. "Your usual table is waiting." "You know me too well," Nolan replied, hanging his coat on the nearby rack. Their usual table sat in the back corner, nestled between the poetry section and a large window that offered the perfect people-watching view of the busy street outside. Violet joined him a few minutes later with 2 steaming mugs, his black coffee and her caramel latte with an extra shot. It was a detail she'd remembered from college, how he needed caffeine more than flavor after long nights of designing. "So, tell me about the restaurant logo project," she said, settling into the worn leather chair across from him. "Did they finally approve your design?" "After 17 revisions, yes," Nolan laughed, pulling out his tablet to show her the final version. "Turns out rustic elegance means something completely different to everyone who uses that phrase." Violet studied the design, a simple but sophisticated emblem that perfectly captured what the restaurant owners had been struggling to articulate. "This is beautiful, Nolan. You've managed to make it feel both timeless and fresh. They're lucky to have you." The way she said it, with such genuine admiration, made warmth spread through his chest. In his previous relationship with Rebecca, his work had been met with polite disinterest. Violet actually understood the thought process behind his creative choices, often catching details others missed. "What about you? How's the children's book club going?" he asked, settling back into his chair. Violet's eyes lit up in the way they always did when she talked about her work. "Oh, you should have seen them last Saturday. We were reading Where the Wild Things Are, and little Tommy Martinez. You remember Professor Martinez from the reunion? His grandson got so excited during the wild rumpus scene that he started howling. Before I knew it, all 8 kids were howling and dancing around the reading circle." "Sounds like chaos," Nolan said, though he was smiling. "The best kind of chaos." Their parents were mortified, but I loved every second of it. There's something magical about watching a child discover a story that speaks to them. As she spoke, animated and passionate, Nolan found himself studying her face, the way her nose crinkled slightly when she laughed, how she tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was thinking, the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident she'd told him about years ago. When had he started memorizing these details? Their conversation flowed from books to dreams to complaints about their respective landlords. Violet mentioned her upstairs neighbor who practiced violin at 6 in the morning, and Nolan shared his ongoing battle with Mrs. Henderson next door, who insisted his music was too loud, despite the fact that he wore headphones 90% of the time. "You know what I realized the other day?" Violet said, wrapping her hands around her mug for warmth. "I look forward to Wednesdays more than weekends now. Because of our coffee dates?" The word dates slipped out before Nolan could stop it, and he felt heat rise to his cheeks. "Because of our coffee meetings," Violet corrected gently, though something flickered across her expression, too quick for him to interpret. They stayed until closing time, as had become their habit. Nolan helped Violet stack chairs and lock up, their movements synchronized from months of the same routine. As they stepped out into the cold evening air, Violet pulled her scarf tighter around her neck. Same time next week? She asked, though they both knew the answer. Wouldn't miss it, he replied, walking her to her car as he always did. Driving home, Nolan found himself thinking about the woman he'd been casually seeing, Jessica from his yoga class. She was attractive, successful, easy to talk to. Everything he should want. So why did he find himself comparing her laugh to Violet's? Why did he catch himself wishing Jessica shared his enthusiasm for late-night conversations about everything and nothing? Meanwhile, across town, Violet sat in her small apartment above the bookstore, staring at her phone. She'd started typing a goodnight text to Nolan 3 times before deleting it each time. When had their friendship started feeling like something more? When had she begun choosing her outfits with him in mind, wondering if he'd noticed the new sweater, or the way she'd styled her hair? She thought about Marcus, the customer who'd asked her out the previous week. He was handsome, well-read, exactly the type of man she'd always imagined herself with. She'd said she needed to think about it, but the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. The truth was that no one made her feel as comfortable, as genuinely happy, as Nolan Rivers did every Wednesday afternoon. Both fell asleep that night with the same unsettling realization. Somewhere between catching up and creating new memories, their friendship had shifted into territory neither was quite ready to acknowledge. The unspoken truth. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, crisp and official, bearing the logo of Hartwell Development Corporation. Violet's hands trembled as she read the words that threatened to shatter her world. Lease termination, property development, 60 days notice. She read it 3 times before the reality sank in. Chapter and verse, her dream made manifest, the place that had become not just her business, but her identity, was being taken away. The building had been sold to developers who planned to tear it down for a luxury apartment complex. 60 days to pack up 5 years of her life and find somewhere else to start over. By the time Nolan arrived for their Wednesday coffee, Violet had managed to compose herself into a fragile semblance of normalcy. The bookstore was unusually quiet, with only Mrs. Patterson browsing the mystery section and the soft jazz playing a melancholy tune that matched Violet's mood. "You look tired," Nolan observed as he approached their usual table, where Violet sat staring into her untouched latte. "Rough night," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Nolan studied her face with the attention of someone who had memorized every expression. "What's wrong, Vi? And don't say nothing because I know that look." The gentleness in his voice nearly undid her careful composure. She handed him the letter without a word, watching as his expression shifted from concern to anger to determination. "Those bastards can't do this," he said, his jaw tightening. "There has to be something. Some legal recourse, some way to fight it. I already called my lawyer. The sale is legitimate and my lease has a development clause. I should have read the fine print more carefully 5 years ago." Her voice was steady, but Nolan caught the slight tremor that betrayed her fear. "Okay, so we find you a new location. There are other buildings in the historic district, other spaces that could work. With what money? Do you know what commercial rent costs now? And even if I could afford it, starting over means losing all my regular customers, the book clubs, the children who come for story time." She stopped, afraid her voice would break. Without thinking, Nolan reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through both of them, but neither pulled away. "We'll figure this out," he said firmly. "I'm not letting you lose this place without a fight." Over the next 2 weeks, Nolan became a fixture at Chapter and Verse. He arrived each morning with coffee and pastries, staying until closing time to help Violet research new locations, crunch numbers, and brainstorm solutions. He designed flyers for a Save the Bookstore campaign and created a social media strategy to raise awareness about the closure. Working side by side for hours each day created an intimacy that their weekly coffee dates had only hinted at. Violet found herself noticing things she'd overlooked before. The way Nolan's brow furrowed when he was concentrating, how he absently ran his fingers through his hair when frustrated, the careful attention he paid to every detail of her crisis as if it were his own. "You know you don't have to do this," Violet said one evening as they sat surrounded by spreadsheets and location listings. "You have your own work, your own life." Nolan looked up from the laptop where he was designing a new logo concept. "Where else would I be?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning neither was ready to examine. Where else would he be? Not with Jessica, whom he'd stopped seeing weeks ago without really understanding why. Not working on the projects that suddenly seemed less important than saving Violet's dream. "I have an idea," he said suddenly, closing the laptop. "What if we rebrand? What if instead of just trying to save chapter and verse as it is, we make it something new? Something that would draw investors or community support?" Violet raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. A community literary center. Not just a bookstore, but a place for workshops, author readings, poetry nights, creative writing classes. Something that positions itself as essential to the cultural fabric of the neighborhood." As he spoke, his enthusiasm infectious, Violet felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. More than that, she felt something else. A warmth that had nothing to do with the space heater in the corner and everything to do with the man across from her who was willing to fight for her dreams as fiercely as his own. Their planning sessions stretched later into the evenings. They ordered takeout and spread their work across the small table in the back of the store, surrounded by towers of books and the soft glow of reading lamps. More than once, Violet caught herself watching Nolan's hands as he sketched logo concepts, or found her gaze lingering on his mouth as he explained his vision for the redesigned space. It was during one of these late-night sessions that their friend Cameron stopped by. Violet had called him for advice about small business loans, and he'd promised to drop off some paperwork after his own work finished. "Sorry I'm so late," Cameron said, pushing through the door and stopping short when he saw them. Nolan and Violet sat close together, their heads bent over a tablet displaying architectural sketches, Violet's hand resting on Nolan's arm as she pointed to something on the screen. "Am I interrupting something?" Cameron asked with a knowing smile. They sprang, apart as if they'd been caught doing something wrong, which only made Cameron's grin wider. "Just working on the rebranding," Violet said quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Right, the rebranding," Cameron nodded, clearly not buying it. "You know, I have to say, you two make a great team. Very complimentary." After Cameron left, an awkward tension settled between them. They packed up their work in relative silence, both hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every moment when they reached for the same pen or their knees bumped under the table. "I should probably head home," Nolan said finally, though it was the last thing he wanted to do. "Of course it's late," Violet agreed, though she made no move toward the door. They stood there for a moment, looking at each other in the dim light of the bookstore, both feeling the weight of unspoken words. Cameron's observation had forced them to acknowledge what they'd been carefully ignoring. They were no longer just friends working together. They were something else, something undefined and potentially dangerous to the easy relationship they'd rebuilt. "Nolan?" Violet started, then stopped, unsure of what she wanted to say. "I know," he said softly. "I feel it too." But neither was brave enough to name what it was, and the moment passed. They locked up the store and walked to their cars, the March air crisp with the promise of spring and the uncertainty of change. That night, both lay awake thinking about Cameron's words and the growing awareness that their friendship was transforming into something that could either be beautiful or ruin everything they'd built together. The moment, everything shifted. The grand reopening of Chapter and Verse Community Literary Center was everything Violet had dreamed it could be, and everything she'd feared it might not be. The space looked transformed. Nolan's design vision had turned the cramped bookstore into an inviting haven with designated areas for readings, workshops, and quiet study. Warm Edison bulb string lights created intimate pockets throughout the space, and his hand-painted signs directed visitors to different sections with whimsical flourishes. By 7 in the evening, the place was packed. Local authors mingled with longtime customers, city council members sampled coffee from the new espresso bar, and children sat mesmerized in the expanded story corner. The fundraising campaign had exceeded their goals, securing enough money for a 5-year lease on the renovated space. Against all odds, they had saved chapter and verse. Violet moved through the crowd like a gracious host, thanking supporters and answering questions about the new programming, but exhaustion was beginning to show around the edges of her bright smile. She'd been running on adrenaline and coffee for weeks, managing construction delays, permit issues, and the 1,000 tiny details that went into transforming a dream into reality. Nolan watched her from across the room, recognizing the signs of someone who was running on empty but couldn't allow herself to stop. He'd been by her side through every crisis and celebration of the past month, and he'd learned to read her moods like weather patterns. Right now, she was holding herself together through sheer willpower. "She's incredible," said Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who'd been one of Chapter and Verse's first customers 5 years ago. She followed Nolan's gaze to where Violet was crouched down, animatedly describing the new children's area to a little girl who clutched a worn copy of Matilda. "Yeah, she is," Nolan replied, surprised by the depth of feeling in his own voice. No, I've been watching you two work together these past weeks," Mrs. Patterson continued with the directness that only octogenarians could get away with. "I've been married for 57 years, dear, and I know what love looks like, even when the people feeling it don't know it yet." Before Nolan could respond, she patted his arm and wandered off toward the poetry section, leaving him standing there with her words echoing in his mind. Love. Was that what this was? This feeling of completeness when Violet was near. This need to be part of every important moment in her life? By 9:30, the crowd had thinned to a handful of stragglers. Violet locked the door behind the last customer and leaned against it, her shoulders finally sagging with relief and exhaustion. The space felt different now, larger and quieter, filled with the lingering energy of a successful celebration. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nolan looked around at the transformed space, at the flowers and congratulatory cards scattered across the counter, at the woman who had poured her heart into making this dream reality. "You did it, Vi. This is all you." "Are you kidding? None of this would have happened without you. The design, the marketing, the business plan, staying up until 3 in the morning stuffing envelopes for the mailing campaign." She shook her head, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his support. "I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me." She pushed herself away from the door and began gathering empty wine glasses, needing something to do with her hands. The silence stretched between them, comfortable but charged with the same tension that had been building for weeks. "Violet." His voice was gentle but serious enough to make her stop and look at him. "You're crying." She touched her cheek in surprise, finding it wet with tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Happy tears," she said with a shaky laugh. "I'm just so relieved and grateful and terrified and—" She trailed off, overwhelmed by the rush of emotions she'd been suppressing all evening. Without hesitation, Nolan crossed the space between them. His thumb brushed away a tear from her cheek, the touch so tender it made her breath catch. They stood there in the fairy-light glow of the transformed bookstore, surrounded by the scent of books and coffee and possibility, closer than friends should stand. "Violet," he said again, her name like a question he'd been afraid to ask. She looked up at him. This man who had appeared at exactly the right moment and refused to leave her side through the most challenging period of her life. His eyes were dark in the dim light, searching her face for permission, for an answer to the question neither had been brave enough to voice. Time seemed suspended as she reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. She'd memorized this face over months of coffee dates and late-night planning sessions. But touching him felt like discovering him all over again. "We shouldn't," she whispered, even as she made no move to step away. "Probably not," he agreed, his voice rough with longing. It could ruin everything. It could, but neither moved away. Instead, they seemed drawn together by an invisible force that had been building since that first night at the reunion. Through every shared laugh and comfortable silence, every moment of understanding that ran deeper than mere friendship. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't the desperate kiss of long-denied passion, but something softer and more profound. It was the kiss of two people who had found their way home to each other without realizing they'd been searching. Violet's hands fisted in his shirt, anchoring herself to this moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. When they finally broke apart, they remained close enough to share breath, foreheads touching in the intimate space they'd created. "Oh," Violet breathed, the simple word carrying the weight of recognition, of everything changing in an instant. "Yeah," Nolan agreed, his thumb still tracing her cheekbone. "Oh." They stood there in their transformed bookstore, surrounded by the dreams they'd saved together, knowing that they'd just crossed a line that would change everything between them. The fear was still there, the terror of losing the friendship that had become the most important thing in both their lives, but it was overshadowed by something stronger. For the first time, the possibility that they might not just be friends felt less scary than the possibility of pretending they were nothing more. As they finally stepped apart and began the familiar routine of closing up the store, both knew that tomorrow would bring questions they weren't ready to answer. But tonight, in this moment of triumph and transformation, they allowed themselves to hold on to the memory of a kiss that felt like coming home. The choice between fear and forever. The first Wednesday after the kiss, neither showed up for coffee. Nolan sat in his home studio, staring at his computer screen where a half-finished logo design mocked him with its incompleteness. He'd been supposed to meet Violet at their usual time, but the thought of sitting across from her at their familiar table, pretending nothing had changed, felt impossible. So he'd texted a lie about a client emergency and spent the afternoon wondering if she was relieved or hurt by his absence. Meanwhile, Violet stood behind the counter at Chapter and Verse, reorganizing the same display of new releases for the third time. When 2:30 came and went without Nolan's familiar silhouette appearing in the doorway, she felt a hollowness in her chest that had nothing to do with the busy day ahead. His text about work had been polite and apologetic, but she could read between the lines. He was avoiding her, avoiding them, avoiding whatever they'd become in that moment, surrounded by fairy lights and possibility. The second Wednesday, they both showed up, but spent the entire hour dancing around the elephant in the room. Their conversation felt stilted, formal, like strangers making polite small talk. Violet asked about his work projects with the careful interest of an acquaintance. Nolan inquired about the bookstore's programming with the detached politeness of a customer. They both left early, claiming other commitments, and walked to their cars without the easy companionship that had defined their friendship. By the third Wednesday, the pretense had become unbearable. "This is ridiculous," Violet said, setting her untouched latte down with enough force to slosh foam over the rim. "We're acting like strangers." Nolan looked up from his equally neglected coffee, his eyes tired. "I know. Are we really going to let one kiss destroy 7 years of friendship?" The word "one" hung between them like an accusation, as if the kiss had been insignificant, a mistake to be dismissed. But they both knew it hadn't been just one kiss. It had been the culmination of months of growing awareness, of feelings that had been building since that first night at the reunion. "Is that what you want?" Nolan asked carefully. "To pretend it never happened?" Violet opened her mouth to say yes, that would be easier, safer, the logical thing to do. Instead, she found herself saying, "I don't know what I want. I just know I miss you. I miss us, the way we were before everything got complicated." "We can't go back," Nolan said quietly. "Even if we wanted to, we can't unknow what we know now." "Which is what exactly? That we're attracted to each other? That we let a moment get away from us?" She was grasping for rational explanations, trying to reduce the magnitude of what had passed between them. "Is that really all it was for you?" His voice was carefully neutral, but she caught the hurt underneath. Violet stared at him across their familiar table, this man who had become the most important constant in her life, who had fought for her dreams as fiercely as his own, who looked at her like she was something precious and rare. The careful walls she'd built around her heart began to crumble. "No," she whispered. "It wasn't." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and terrifying. "I've been thinking about you for months," Nolan said, his voice barely above a murmur. "Not just as a friend, Vi. I've been thinking about what it would be like to wake up next to you, to be the person you call when something wonderful happens, to build something real with you beyond Wednesday coffee dates." Violet felt her breath catch. "Nolan, I know it's complicated. I know we could lose everything if this doesn't work. But I also know I'm tired of pretending I don't feel this way about you. I'm tired of dating other people and wishing they were you. I'm tired of loving you in secret." The word love settled between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Violet felt tears prick at her eyes. Not the happy tears of the reopening night, but tears of recognition and fear and hope all tangled together. "What if we ruin this?" she asked, gesturing to the space between them, to the friendship that had become the foundation of both their lives. "What if we try and fail and lose each other completely? What if we don't try and spend the rest of our lives wondering what could have been?" They sat in silence for a long moment, both weighing the risks against the possibilities. Around them, the bookstore hummed with quiet afternoon activity, customers browsing, the soft whisper of turning pages, the distant hum of the espresso machine. This place that had brought them back together, that they had saved together, that had witnessed the moment everything changed. "I love you too," Violet said finally, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of months of denied feelings. "I think I've loved you since college, and I was too scared to admit it then. I'm still scared now, but I'm more scared of losing you by doing nothing." Nolan reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both new and familiar. "So what do we do?" "We try," she said, her voice growing stronger. "We take it slow, we communicate, we remember that our friendship is the foundation of whatever this becomes. And if it doesn't work—" She paused, unable to finish the sentence. "It will work," Nolan said with quiet conviction. "It has to, because I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore. Not as just a friend, not as just anything. I want all of you, Vi. The Wednesday coffee dates and the late-night phone calls and the lazy Sunday mornings and the fights about whose turn it is to do dishes. I want the whole messy, beautiful, complicated thing." Violet laughed through her tears, squeezing his hand. "Okay, then. Let's be messy and beautiful and complicated together." 6 months later, on a crisp October evening that echoed the night they'd reunited, Nolan and Violet stood in chapter and verse after closing, surrounded by the warm glow of string lights and the comfortable chaos of a day well lived. The bookstore had become more successful than either had dared to dream. The community center model had attracted grant funding, media attention, and a loyal following that kept the place bustling from morning until night. But more than that, they had found their way to each other completely. The transition from friendship to love hadn't been without its challenges. There had been awkward moments, difficult conversations, and the learning curve of becoming lovers as well as best friends. But every obstacle had only proven what they'd suspected that night of their first kiss. They were stronger together than apart. "Ready to go home?" Nolan asked, slipping his arms around Violet from behind as she locked up the register. "Ready," she said, leaning back against his chest and marveling at how natural it felt, how right. As they walked to their cars, still separate, but not for much longer, given the apartment they'd started looking at together, Violet reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From college study partners to estranged acquaintances to reunited friends to something deeper and more enduring than either had thought possible. "Thank you," she said suddenly, stopping under the same streetlight where everything had begun to change. "For what?" "For being patient, for fighting for us even when I was too scared to fight for myself, for loving me enough to risk everything." Nolan cupped her face in his hands, looking at her with the same wonder he'd felt that first night at the reunion, multiplied by months of discovery and deepening connection. "Thank you for being worth the risk," he said, and kissed her under the streetlight, surrounded by the quiet magic of a love that had grown from the strongest foundation of all, a friendship that had weathered time and change and fear to become something extraordinary. Some love stories begin with lightning strikes and grand gestures. Theirs had begun with coffee and conversation, with showing up and staying present, with the slow recognition that the person you've been looking for might have been beside you all along. And as they drove home separately but together, both knew that this was just the beginning of their real story, the one they would write together, one ordinary, beautiful day at a time.